So you're a service member. You requested a religious accommodation on the vaccine, and it was denied. Now what? I'm Stuart Shepard, and this is First Liberty Live. Before we get started, thank you for liking and sharing our videos. That's the way that we get to meet new people and to expand this project. If you're on YouTube or if you're on FirstLibertyLive.com, make sure you click the subscribe button. That way we'll let you know when new episodes come out so you don't miss a thing. Hey, Mike Berry is General Counsel here at First Liberty Institute. He also served overseas in the Marines and currently serves as a Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserve. Hi, Mike. Hey, Stuart. He focuses on military affairs here at First Liberty Institute. We want to make sure, just for clarity, that you are speaking today out of uniform as the First Liberty Live attorney, not as that other job that
That's right.
Just to be clear. And we're going to be offering insights today. But we want to make sure you also know we're not suggesting whether you should or should not take the vaccine. We're not experts at that. That's up for you to make the decision. We will be offering insights into what the law says, but before you make any choices on your own, before you take any action, you will want to consult with your own attorney. Did I say all that right?
Exactly.
I want to make sure we get all the disclaimers in there. Okay, Mike, you were here a couple of weeks ago. And we talked at length about the military vaccine mandate. For anyone looking for the full background, of course, they can go to FirstLibertyLive.com. But now we're in the midst of this. Give me some examples of some of the outrageous conduct, outrageous directives, rather, that you've been seeing coming down.
Well, one that I just saw recently was a directive that essentially bans travel for anybody who's not been vaccinated within the DoD. But it doesn't just apply to service members. Of course, if you're in uniform, you're subject to DoD rules and regulations. They can restrict your travel if there's a legitimate reason to do so.
Right.
But most people would, I think, intuitively understand that the DoD doesn't have authority, doesn't have jurisdiction over people who aren't in the military. For example, if the Department of Defense, if Secretary Austin wanted to order you to do something, Stuart, you would rightfully say, I'm a civilian. I'm not subject to your orders.
Yep.
Well, guess what? That also applies to the vast majority of what we refer to as DoD dependents, military dependents, spouses, children, people who may be dependents in the home.
So they're putting the travel restriction on family members who aren't in the military?
That's right, for both official and the key is unofficial travel.
Well,
so here's the example that I give. If my wife receives word that her parents or her grandparents are gravely ill and are in their last moments, and she wants to fly home to see them, is she allowed to? And the DoD is essentially saying, well, if she's not vaccinated, no.
Wow.
She doesn't get to go do that. And my question is, well, what authority does the Department of Defense have to tell my wife, who is not a service member, what she can or cannot do?
And I met Kelly, so I can imagine what she would do.
Yeah. For those who know my wife, you would probably agree that her response would be, watch me.
So this is the Pentagon, the Department of Defense.
Yes.
Trying to extend power beyond even where they have authority. But even within where they have authority, they're making requests, it appears, that go beyond what is appropriate. We want to talk about that. Last time we talked about the process of requesting a religious accommodation if you have a serious religious objection to receiving the vaccine, that there is a process that you can ask for an accommodation. To set up this conversation, just summarize that for me. People can watch it in the earlier episode, but just what's the short version? Yeah,
if you are serving in the military and you have a sincere religious objection to the vaccine, we encourage you to submit a religious accommodation request. There are resources available on the First Liberty website. So at firstliberty.org, there's a vaccine mandate help feature that's there. There are 3 buttons. The one in the middle is for service members. That's where you'll go to get a resource guide, a toolkit that will help walk you through that process, provide templates, the type of formatting you need to use, the language you need to use, so you can follow the correct procedures and submit that religious accommodation request. That is the most important first step that you have to take.
Okay. So here's the key question that many people are now living through right now, and that is, you file a request for a religious accommodation, you get a denial back, now what?
Yeah, and this is what we're starting to see, is this very first wave of denials. If your religious accommodation request is denied, number one, It's not the end of the story, okay? There's many more steps that can happen between the denied religious accommodation request and the proverbial end of the road, right? Where now you have to make that choice between, do I get the jab or does something else happen to me?
Yeah.
So just because your accommodation request is denied doesn't mean that you're now stuck without any options. By federal law and DoD regulation, you have the right to appeal that denial. And obviously, depending on what branch of the service you're in, your appeal is going to largely take one of four tracks, right? In your appeal, you will appeal the denial of the religious accommodation to the service secretary for your branch of the service or whomever they've delegated.
Okay.
Right? And now, according to DoD regulations, and for those who want to know the exact regulation, it's Department of Defense Instruction 1300.17. Make sure you get the 2020 version, the September 2020 revision. There were substantial revisions made in September of 2020, so make sure you're using that version and not an earlier version that's now obsolete. That instruction, DoD instruction 1300.17, contains important timelines for how long the Department of Defense has to rule on one of these appeals, who the appeal goes to, right, and then what can happen next, right, what the standards are for that appeal. So, again, there are important procedural safeguards that are already enshrined in DoD regulations that, regardless of who's trying to tell you, oh, no, that's it, your accommodation request was denied, you got to get the shot now. Whoever's saying that, because I've been hearing a lot of horror stories.
Yeah.
My husband's accommodation request was denied, or my accommodation was request denied, and now they're telling me if I don't get the shot that I'm going to get court-martialed. That's just flat out not true. That is absolutely not true. So whoever's saying that, they need to stop, right? And they need to recognize that our service members still have protections under the law. You don't give up your rights just because you serve in the military.
And so much of military training is to learn to take orders and to follow them expeditiously. But that doesn't mean that you give up all your rights. There are certain things that you carry with you, even when you're in uniform, that you can do. If you were writing this appeal, if you were in that position, what are some things you would make sure to include in it when you wrote it up?
Well, I sure hope that I'm never in a position to have to write one of these appeals for myself, but I actually anticipate that I might be in that position one day, sir. So I've actually thought about this a lot, right? If I were writing my own appeal from my denied religious accommodation request, there are a number of things that I think are important to include. And the good news is at First Liberty, we've actually done this before on behalf of some of our previous clients. We've represented service members who have requested religious accommodations or have taken other administrative actions to defend their First Amendment rights and have had those actions come back essentially denied, and we've had to appeal that through the military system. And we've been very, very successful at learning sort of the best practices, right? So I'm not here to deliver a one-size-fits-all. I'm here to really offer best practices because everybody's situation is unique. Everybody's circumstances are unique. And I suppose I should have started with that caveat that when you're submitting a religious accommodation request, although it is tailored to your individual religious beliefs, the formatting is going to be the same. It's going to be on generally a standardized form. You know, if you're like me, if you're in the Navy or the Marine Corps, we actually call them NAVMAC forms, which is Navy and Marine Corps forms, right? So they're pretty standardized. Yeah. Maybe the substance and the content can be tailored to your circumstances,
tailored, right?
Yeah. But when it comes to the appeal, it gets a little more open-ended, right, in terms of, okay, what am I supposed to put in there? What should it look like? I think here are some best practices for people who've had their accommodation request denied. I would start with identifying any factual discrepancies, right? So anything that is in the denial that you believe is factually in error, you want to highlight that and note that and say, anything, even things like if they get the date wrong, right, that on such and such date, the Secretary of Defense issued the order or the directive to get if the date was wrong, say no, actually that's a factual discrepancy. Yeah. Here's one that a lot of people have been talking about. The mandate says, the Department of Defense mandate says, you have to get the FDA approved COVID-19 vaccine. And then they say, And so here are the vaccines that you can choose from to get. Well, guess what? A factual discrepancy would be there's only one FDA-approved vaccine currently available in the United States. Right? It's the Pfizer Comirnaty. That's the only one available. And Pfizer itself has put out a statement saying, but the Comirnaty vaccine that's FDA-approved is not going to be available in the United States until 2023. So I would note that factual discrepancy. The only FDA-approved vaccine is Pfizer Comirnaty. The DoD's list of here are the approved vaccines, you would say these are not FDA-approved vaccines.
Right.
They might be under an emergency use authorization, but they're not FDA-approved. So again, you go through and you highlight and you cite every factual discrepancy. That's part one. Part two, again, if I were doing this for myself, I would then start highlighting all the legal discrepancies that I find, right? So in other words, anytime I believe that the DoD has reached a conclusion that is legally incorrect. So in other words, this is a lawful order. If you don't believe it's a lawful order,
right,
then
okay. Yeah.
And again, we're not taking a position at this moment on I'm not here to get into a debate on First Liberty Law about whether it's a lawful order or not, because that's ultimately going to be a question for a judge to decide, and I'm not a judge. I'm just saying that if that's the basis that you want to use, then you should use it. So factual discrepancies, legal discrepancies, and then I think you would provide any sort of amplifying information that you think supports those. If you have any supporting documentation, affidavits from experts, statements from religious leaders, statements from your doctors, right, that say my patient has a severe medical issue and I don't believe that the vaccine would be helpful. In fact, it would be harmful to all those things are going to be helpful. Anything that you can add to bolster your appeal, I would include those as enclosures. Then you provide a succinct conclusion, and then you submit it to the appropriate authority.
Now, I try not to get too deep into legalese here, but we do try to translate and make it accessible for the rest of us, if you will. This falls under a test that's generally expressed as strict scrutiny. That's the legal term. I'm not an attorney, so help me understand what I just said.
Well, strict scrutiny is the term that attorneys use to describe the legal standard that is applied to a lot of issues that arise in the religious freedom context. Generally speaking, strict scrutiny is the strongest legal protection available in our legal system in America.
Okay.
And really, what strict scrutiny does is it here's how it functions. If I have a religious belief or religious exercise, a belief, a practice, or something that I want to do or I want to practice, and the government is doing something that would substantially burden my religious practice. Okay. I'm going to use a way oversimplified example, but if the government passed a law saying you're not allowed to go to church, nobody is allowed to go to church anymore, I would say, well, my religious beliefs compel me to go to church, and the government is telling me I can't go to church. That's substantially burdening my religious exercise, the free exercise of my religion as protected under the First Amendment. Right?
And again, to be clear, this is a hypothetical.
But it makes the point. So, under strict scrutiny, if I can show that I have the sincere religious belief and that the government is substantially burdening it, then I've done all I need to do. At that point, it's called we say the burden shifts. The burden shifts to the government to prove that in order for the government to essentially get away with it, right? In order for the government to win in banning me from going to church, it's going to have to show, one, that it has a compelling interest, a compelling governmental interest, and that interest is the least restrictive way of accomplishing that interest, least restrictive on my religious beliefs. Now, here's where it gets really important in the vaccine mandate context. Strict scrutiny also requires, according to federal law and according to Supreme Court cases, that the strict scrutiny test has to be what's called an individualized inquiry. So in other words, the government doesn't get to say, you can't go to church. Why? Just because we just don't think it's a good idea for people to go to church, right? That's called a broad, generalized assertion, right? It's a generalized interest. The government can't just say something that's so vague and general and just say, well, we're the government, we've got these really important things that we have to do, so people have to follow our rules, right? No, the government has to tailor its analysis. When it's trying to satisfy its burden,
it has to talk about
it has to address your specific circumstances.
And now it makes sense to me, because last time you were here, you brought several denials, and they were all the same. They were copy and paste. That's why that's a problem, is what I'm hearing here.
Right. So what we're seeing at First Liberty is, because I've been asking people, hey, if you get a denial, it's not that I'm able to represent you, and we can't represent everybody. Right? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I am very interested in seeing the denial letters, because the more that we receive that look like, quite literally, carbon copies of one another, the more we build that case that it sure doesn't look like these are individualized inquiries. It sure looks like somebody drafted a form letter that's just we received your religious accommodation request. But we reviewed it. It's denied. Why is it denied? Well, because the government has an interest in making everybody get the vaccine. And that sounds exactly like what federal law and the Supreme Court has said is a generalized assertion of governmental interest.
Which means it does not meet.
Which means that it is, in other words, what I'm saying is the Department of Defense is not addressing your individual specific religious exercise.
Okay.
And here's the kicker on this, though, Stuart. I've been saying since day one, this is such a terrible idea, this vaccine mandate, because I knew that it would be impossible for the government to be able to do that for the tens of thousands, if not, in fact, I saw a Washington Post article this morning that just said, literally said hundreds of thousands of service members are still unvaccinated and refuse to vaccinate. Well, that means the Department of Defense, whoever is tasked with addressing these religious accommodation requests is going to have to do hundreds of thousands of individualized accommodation requests, grants or denies.
Right.
And if you're going to deny, let's just say it's 100,000, to use a nice round number. If you're going to deny 100,000 religious accommodation requests, they're going to have to do 100,000 individualized inquiries according to federal law. Now, there might be a judge out there that says that's just unreasonable to hold the government to that standard. Look, I'm not telling you what a judge is going to do. I'm telling you what the law requires.
Very good. Give me an example of a time when a religious accommodation was improperly denied, to help put this in context.
Well, there's one right there, right? The failure to follow what strict scrutiny requires. That's one example. But other examples that I've seen are, some of them are outrageous. I've seen some where Catholic service members have submitted a religious accommodation request, and they cite their Catholic beliefs, and particularly the Catholic position on life and abortion.
Right.
And saying that, according to the Catholic Church and our teachings and our beliefs, we cannot, I can't participate in anything that I understand or I know or I've been informed to be complicit in abortion. Including the use of aborted fetal cells in the testing or production of a vaccine or any other medical product. I can't participate in that. And of course, as is well known now, it's been well publicized, the Vatican put out a statement saying that we don't discourage faithful Catholics from the vaccine because we do not believe that it is morally wrong to get the vaccine. Now, what they didn't say was, therefore you must get the vaccine. They just said it's not morally wrong to get it if you choose to get the vaccine. But most Catholics I know would also say, that you shouldn't force people to get it if it violates their conscience either. I've yet to meet a Catholic who doesn't believe that. To answer your question about what's an example of a really bad denial, what I've seen happening from the Department of Defense is they're taking that statement from the Vatican, saying it's not morally wrong to get the vaccine, and they're weaponizing it. And they're saying the Vatican has said that it's okay to get the vaccine. Therefore, you, service member, don't have a right to use that as a basis for objecting. Right? That you can't claim that the Catholic Church, your Catholic beliefs and Catholic teaching and Catholic doctrine won't allow you to get the vaccine.
So let me say it back to you. It's, on the one hand, what they said was it's not wrong to take it, but they didn't say you should. They're taking that and saying you should because they said so. So that's wrong. But even beyond that, it really comes down to the individual beliefs, not even what a faith group says about it.
That's right. And where it really gets, I think, beyond the pale and really quite offensive is when you start to hear military commanders and officials saying things like, well, if that's your religious objection, then either you're really not a Catholic or you're not a very good Catholic.
Ouch.
Because you're not. And again, that's where it becomes so inappropriate. There's no place ever in this country for a government official to step in and essentially dictate to somebody what their religious beliefs should be or what the correct interpretation of their religious doctrine should be.
So the word outrageous really captures a lot of this. And you and I were talking earlier, I'm not an expert in this, but you mentioned something called military counseling forums. Am I saying it right?
Yes.
And how those will sometimes show up. And I can imagine someone sitting in an office, a superior officer, sliding a sheet of paper across the desk and saying, I need you to sign, or I would like you to sign this. Now, it's not expressed as an order, but it sounds like an order when you hear it. If someone has that pushed across to them, a statement that they're being asked to sign, what should they do in that moment?
Well, I'm gonna answer. They should not sign it, and here's why.
Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot about these counseling forms, and those who have served in the military, you know that a counseling form is usually not a good thing. All right, it very seldomly is, hey, I got counseled this morning by the commander. Most people hear that and they don't think, oh, congratulations.
Yeah.
And these counseling forms, they're using them to begin creating a paper record, right? That the military can then use against this person later on to try to separate them or try to take some other adverse action against them.
Yeah.
But the counseling forms, at least the ones that people have sent to me that I've reviewed, they say things like, I acknowledge, or and then state your name, acknowledge that I have received a lawful order to get the COVID-19 vaccine. I acknowledge that the COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective at preventing, COVID, and so on and so all these acknowledgments, right? And then at the bottom it says, sign here, okay? Number one rule, all right, my number one rule that I've been preaching to service members from the very first day I became a lawyer in the Marine Corps, which is never, ever sign something that is not 100% true and accurate.
Because it will come back around.
It will come back to haunt you. And I don't care if that's a motor pool log, a serialized gear log, or a legal document that says, I agree that this is a safe, because if you don't agree that it's a safe and effective vaccine, then don't sign it.
Okay. Because
you can't sign, once you've signed it, and even more importantly, if there's anytime you see the word waive, right? I waive my right to read that extremely carefully.
W-A-I-V-E.
W-A-I-V-E.
Yeah.
Right? Waiver of rights and acknowledgement form. You want to be extremely careful about not waiving your rights to whatever it is that it's saying you're waiving your rights to.
Now, let's say it escalates a bit, because I can picture this happening. You've got the person on the other side of the desk is frustrated with this whole thing, just trying, because they've got directions coming from above on how to handle this and what to do. So they say, well, you're not going to leave my office. I'm not going to let you leave my office until you sign that form.
Look, in the military, we all understand the superior-subordinate relationship, the necessity of following orders, right? Obedience to orders, obedience to directives. We all understand that. Mm-hmm. But that entire structure is premised on the assumption that the orders given will be lawful orders. And our country, we had Nuremberg trials. We had the My Lai massacre court-martials, right? To help us understand, not only can you not follow an unlawful order, you have an obligation to challenge an unlawful order. And so if somebody slides, and I don't care what rank they have on their collar, right? They could be an NCO or they could be a 4-star general. If they slide something in front of you, say, sign this, and you're not allowed to leave this room until you sign it. All right, I want everybody to listen to me. If that happens to you, and I've already heard numerous horror stories of that happening, of people being forced to sign something against their will that essentially waives some of their rights or acknowledges that the vaccine is safe and effective and they will get the vaccine within X number of days, and they're being told, if you don't sign this, you cannot leave this room. If that happens to you, the only words out of your mouth need to be the following. Am I under arrest or am I free to go? When somebody who has authority over you tells you you have to do X or you cannot leave, only words out of your mouth. Am I under arrest or am I free to go? And if they say, well, then you can't leave, then you say, very well, I understand that I am under arrest. I would like to exercise my right to speak to an attorney. And you just repeat that. You don't say another word other than, am I under arrest or am I free to go? And if they don't let you leave, you say, I would like to speak to my attorney since I'm under arrest. Right? And 9 out of 10 times you will see them begin fumbling over their words and backpedaling and saying, well, wait a minute, that's not quite what we meant. Okay, here, let me go get it, let me talk to so-and-so. But that's the importance of understanding what your rights are, Stuart. And if that has happened to you, first of all, that's horrific. I'm sorry, that shouldn't be happening in our country. It shouldn't be happening in our military. And going back to what we talked about earlier, what should you put in your appeal? Remember I said factual discrepancies, legal discrepancies, and then any amplifying information and documentation. That should be included. This is what happened to me. All right? I was not allowed to leave my workspace. I was not allowed to leave base. Anything that they're doing to you to harass you, to intimidate you, to threaten you, you document it meticulously, and you include it in that appeal. Because again, you want to create the strongest, most powerful appeal possible from a factual standpoint, a legal standpoint, and then sort of from maybe I would call it the emotional standpoint, right? To say, this is what they're doing to somebody who is trying to serve this country and protect our freedoms and our rights. And I've said this before, I'll say it again here. Right now, as we speak, death row inmates and illegal immigrants have more rights in this country than service members who have a sincere religious objection to the vaccine do.
You're talking about the strong emotions that go with this. Those are, I think, primarily fear and anxiety over that moment you just described, because it takes a lot to speak in that manner, in that setting, in that moment. And I think it largely comes down to this. We don't talk about people working in the military. We talk about people who serve in the military. It's not like other jobs out there. It is a different relationship with your employer, if you will. But it also changes when you end your employment, whether by choice or by firing. There are consequences that may come into play that are far beyond what we deal with in what I would call the ordinary workplace.
Yeah, look, if you're in the military, we all recognize there are several ways to leave the military. There's voluntarily, right? You can retire, you can resign, you can separate, and then there's sort of the involuntary path. Court-martial is the bad one, right? But right behind that is what we call an administrative separation. I want everybody who's watching this or listening to this to understand clearly. I know that many of you have been threatened and intimidated and harassed with, well, if you don't get the vaccine, we're going to court-martial you and you're going to get a dishonorable discharge. Or the one that's more common is we're going to process you for separation and you'll get what's called an OTH, an other than honorable discharge. And that's where it carries with it many of the same consequences. Because think about this, Stuart. The court-martial process means that you're being charged with a crime.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you leave the military through a court-martial, you now have a criminal conviction on your record, and many times you also leave with jail time, right? So they're going to, if you're in the civilian sector and you don't get the vaccine, you lose your job, right? Which is horrific in and of its own, but at least
you're not going to jail.
At least you don't have a criminal record, and at least you're not behind bars. Right. But in the military, they're threatening to court-martial people and put them behind bars with criminal records. What I want people to understand, though, is that there's a lot of fear and intimidation that comes with that. But as I said earlier, we have this thing called due process. Service members have a right to counsel. They have a right to fight for themselves in that court-martial with their legal team. And even if they try to process you for separation, it's not a paper exercise. It's not somebody sitting behind a desk that just signs with the stroke of a pen and then just says, you're out now.
Thanks.
Right? Yeah. You have the right to challenge the separation proceedings. If you have I'll speak to the Navy and Marine Corps because that's what I'm most familiar with.
Right.
If you have 6 years or more in the service, you're entitled to what's called a separation board. You go to a board and you have the proverbial jury of your peers that gets to decide, do we want to kick this person out? If they're going to try to kick you out with anything other than an honorable discharge, right, they have to meet certain requirements which are very difficult for the government to meet. Right? I don't need to get into all the minutiae here. We don't have time for that. But just suffice it to say, don't give in, right? Do not capitulate to their bullying and their threats. Just understand that oftentimes they're hollow threats. There are hollow threats that have nothing behind them. And so we just need people to stay strong.
I know you've been getting an overwhelming number of requests, and our organization is only so big. We only have so many people, so we can't personally handle all of those. And that's why we thought it would be good to do this video to unpack a lot of this so we can serve as many people as possible.
That's right. Look, First Liberty is 100% donor funded, which we greatly appreciate every dollar that we receive. But that also means we have limited resources because we do every case free of charge. None of our clients ever receive a bill from us. That also means, though, that we have limited capacity, right? We can't, as much as I would love to represent every single service member that came through our doors or contacted us at firstliberty.org, we can't. We just, but that doesn't mean that there's not hope for you, right? First of all, like I said, the law is strong on this, right? We have the strongest legal protection available in the law if you have a religious freedom claim. And even if you don't, we have due process, right? So stay firm in your convictions and stay firm and know that it's not the end of the road for you.
All right. Anything else you'd like to share before I let you go? I appreciate all the insight today. A lot of good stuff in there.
No, again, just want everybody to know that First Liberty is proud to represent our service members, and you do not give up your religious freedom just because you serve in uniform. So keep fighting. Keep doing what's right.
And let us know. I mean, you can always contact us through the form on the homepage of firstliberty.org. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for your service. Lots of important information there. We put together some information that will summarize the points that he made today about religious accommodation. If you go to firstliberty.org, you can look on the homepage for the section entitled Vaccine Mandate Help. There's a button there for the military. Just click on that and you can find a one-sheet that we have as well as the earlier conversation that we did. It's free. We want you to have it. It's for you. And we will see you next time right here on First Liberty Live.